All right. Let's kick this off on time. Lovely to see some of you on this, at least in our part of the world, a lovely weekend afternoon. Welcome to our panel on centering workplace power, the key to restoring economic fairness, freedom, democracy, and racial and gender equity. And the nice thing about a long title for a panel is it really truly speaks for itself. So that we have an outstanding interdisciplinary panel to discuss this topic. I'm going to keep the introductions of the speakers very, very short. Once I'm through with those introductions, I'll post into the chat the longer bios that are also available in Box. But let's start with Elizabeth Anderson, who's the Arthur F. Thurnau Professor and John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's Studies at the University of Michigan, and the author of, among other books, Private Government, How Employers Rule Our Lives and Why We Don't Talk About It. Next in alphabetical order, Alexander Hertel Fernandez is a political scientist and an associate professor of public affairs at Columbia University. And he's the author of Politics at Work, among many other publications. He's currently serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Research at the Department of Labor, but of course he's speaking to us today only in his personal capacity. Suresh Naidu is Professor of Economics and International Public Affairs at Columbia University, a colleague of Alexander's, where he teaches economics, political economy, and development. And I think it's fair to say that he is spreading the UC Berkeley economics gospel. Jenny Yang is currently serving as Director of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs at the U.S. Department of Labor. From 2013 to 2018, she was Chair and Commissioner of the EEOC, and she is also speaking here only in her personal capacity. Lawrence Michel was the Economic Policy Institute's first research director, then its vice president and president, and he is now a distinguished fellow at EPI and leads its Unequal Bargaining Power Initiative. This panel is part of that brainchild of his. And so I'm going to start by asking Larry to give us a brief introduction to the project.
Well, thank you, Cindy, and thank you all for attending. Yes, this is a grouping of folks involved with the Unequal Bargaining Power Initiative at the Economic Policy Institute, a 3-year initiative. The foundational ideas of the initiative are that unequal power does a number of things, none of which are very good. Unequal workplace power creates a lack of freedom in the workplace and beyond the workplace. 2, unequal power undermines constitutional, statutory, and common law workplace protections. 3rd, it generates wage and income inequality and wage suppression. 4th, it weakens civic engagement and representative democracy. And last, it hobbles the ability to adequately address workplace race and gender discrimination. And these foundational intellectual pillars will be illustrated by the presentations that you'll hear today. We conclude that this being the case, that we need to center workplace power in everything we do in employment law, economics, social policy, political science, and philosophy. It should be the starting point of much of what we do. And that unequal power is not, in the language of economists, the result of a few imperfections, like the rise of non-competes. Rather, it is inherent in the nature of the contract under capitalism in so-called competitive labor markets, where unequal power is the norm, not the exception. And last, a theme of the last year of the project is critiquing the so-called ideology of freedom to contract that suggests that when workers and employers reach an agreement, it somehow should be considered optimal and deferred to by the law. We believe that there's substantial evidence that goes that employer power is pervasive, that quitting isn't effective, that workers face high unemployment most of the time, and therefore freedom of contract does not make sense, that workers have many of their options removed by their circumstances, their lack of wealth. And moreover, the idea that if we violate this freedom of contract, that and subject employers to rules and limitations that'll somehow sabotage the economy is not true. And the evidence about labor flexibility, the minimum wages, co-determination, and many other things show that we can limit management's rights in many important ways and still get a very good economic performance, as well as if we didn't, or better. And with that, I'll turn it back to Cindy. And anyone interested in the project, go find our website at epi.org, Unequal Bargaining Power.
All right, thanks so much, Larry. So now we're going to our lightning round. It is a little unsatisfying to give each of these eminent scholars 5 minutes. All of them, you can find work online, and these papers are pouring into the EPI website. So that's the best place to go if you want to pursue any of these scholars' work further. But I'm going to start with me, but you're supposed to be picturing Sam Bagenstos, who's one of the major contributors to the project, but he is currently too busy with the work of the American people to be with us today. So I am going to very briefly channel his excellent paper, which is already posted on the EPI website. It's called Lochner Lives On. And what Sam shows is that the central, so Lochner, I don't know how many of you non-lawyers are familiar with Lochner, but Lochner was a case in the early 20th century that constitutionalized the assumption of equal bargaining power. When I say it constitutionalized it, meaning it used that constitutionalized assumption of equal bargaining power to strike down legislation that was premised on the opposite assumption, that workers need protection, that they need legislative intervention, that they need collective action and protection of union activity in order to actually have a fair shake at the workplace. So Lochner is famously dead in one sense. It is famously dead in the sense that the court no longer uses this old notion of liberty of contract as a constitutional basis for striking down economic and labor legislation. There are some constitutional echoes of Lochner in other doctrines, but by and large, Congress has the power, the states have the power to regulate in this field. But what Sam's paper shows is the extent to which the underlying assumption of equal bargaining power has survived. He calls it, Lochner is undead in the sense that that presumption of equal bargaining power survives and shapes the law of labor and employment in ways that handicap workers continue to handicap workers. So in principle, the field is clear for Congress and the state legislatures to legislate out of its own assumptions, their own assumptions about inequality of bargaining power. But he identifies 4 areas in which the assumption of equal bargaining power survives. The employment at will presumption is the most important one. And the idea of employment at will as the starting point and employers' ability to expressly reclaim that power of employment at will gives employers the power to fire workers for no reason at all. There are lots of reasons they can't fire people nowadays, but they can fire them for no reason. And that undermines every single one of workers' other rights at work, because it subjects employees to the potentially arbitrary power and the fear that imposes on workers so that they fear to assert their rights at work. That, I think, and the most of the paper is devoted to the ways in which employment at will doctrine, both how it reflects the old Lochner presumptions, but also how it undermines other workplace rights. Second, he develops the significance of the presumption of equal bargaining power in the basic decision whether employees are employees or rather independent contractors. That is based on it's based on the facts on the ground, but the facts on the ground are deeply shaped by the title, the name, and the documents that employers impose as a take it or leave it matter on their workers. So workers they think they're independent contractors. That alone inhibits them from claiming other rights at work. And then the contract itself sometimes shapes how courts make that decision. Third, and this is the one I would rank just behind employment at will in its significance, is the law of forced arbitration. The presumption that there is an agreement when employers impose as a take it or leave it, if you show up for work the next day, if you choose to work here, you give up your right to litigate any of your employment rights. At the back end, undermines workers' rights to enforce all those statutory protections and common law protections that have evolved. And then finally, the status of right to work laws and the kind of emanations from the right to work idea similarly reflects a continuing presumption of unequal bargaining power. So I will leave the rest of that, this to Sam's paper, which is excellent and entirely accessible to non-lawyers. It's a wonderful introduction to both the history of labor and employment law and some of the sort of ghosts of the past that are still haunting its presence. So that, I think, takes me to Suresh, who, while you might not have been tuned in when I introduced you as a proselytizer for the UC Berkeley view of the world. But so can you tell us a bit about how modern economic thinking on labor markets and the state of bargaining power at work differs from the assumption of equal bargaining power?
Yeah, great, thanks. So I think a useful place to start is actually why you might, under one view of the labor market, you might not think that you need anything like employment regulation or, there's no actual need for the government to regulate any dimension of the labor contract, is kind of the assumption that there's always going to be some other employer that's willing to poach another a worker that's dissatisfied with their job. So basically, any unhealthy workplace or any abusive foreman would rapidly see the workers leave until there was nobody left, and that discipline of competition is what keeps workplaces roughly at parity between workers and firms. And so the interesting developments, I think, in modern labor economics are kind of how that has been, what the kind of evidence base has sort of changed that sort of points to this view that it's actually pretty hard to quit your job. And in particular, like quitting your job, quits don't seem to be that responsive to wages and working conditions necessarily. And so let me give a little bit of the background on this evidence, which I think actually in some ways starts with the puzzle of the minimum, of like why the minimum wage wasn't having these obvious negative employment effects. Like, if the prediction of sort of standard economic theory is so stark, it should have just jumped out of the data. And I would say the evidence has kind of mostly spoken, but even if there's still a debate, it's kind of just not so obviously a big negative effect that you have to wonder what else is going on. And so I think that kind of gave the stimulus to thinking about, hey, well, maybe if employers are actually setting wages, then maybe the laissez-faire unregulated wages that we see are actually too low, because employers are willing to like set wages too low. They're going to be willing to bear the additional turnover. It's worth it to them because they save on payroll. And so, yeah, you might suffer a few more quits and have a hard time recruiting workers, but you're willing to do it because you're saving on payroll. And in that case, what happens is that the minimum wage sort of increases, and actually employers, find themselves expanding employment on some margin where they're raising, where will those sort of see turnover fall. And sorry, this is Sarojini, come on. Sorry. This is the
I think we should probably come back to Suresh a little later. So let me move on to Alex. So you are a social scientist, and that's a political scientist in particular, and you take that perspective. Suresh, I just thought we could come back to you a little bit later.
Sure.
Okay.
Thanks.
Or is it better to just keep going? Or
either way.
Okay. All right. Why don't you go? We'll come back to you, Alex.
Okay. So sorry, as I was saying, apologies for that. When you then force some employers to pay a higher wage, what happens is their turnover falls. And some evidence of this was sort of found in this Journal of Labor Economics paper, where you find that firms that are places that are hit with a minimum wage see a fall in new recruits, but they also see an almost equal fall in quits. And so when you put those two things together, that's one sort of accounting for the lack of an overall effect of the minimum wage on employment. And so I think that that was kind of, I think, the first thread of things that pointing towards this view that quitting your job isn't so easy, and when quitting your job isn't so easy, employers have some space where they can set wages. The other sort of piece of evidence, or another piece of evidence, has been sort of the rise of matched worker firm administrative data, where you can see literally which employer a given worker is at. And so if the labor market looked like perfect competition, which employer you're at shouldn't have any predictive content in the wage, because every employer has to pay the same wage. And if any employer was paying below the quote unquote market wage, they would, again, rapidly lose their workers to another firm that's paying a higher wage. And so firms shouldn't matter in kind of a perfect competition neoclassical view of the labor market. And yet, sort of when we look at it, we can sort of see that for the same worker, when they switch to a high wage firm, they then get a higher wage. And then when that same worker switches to a low wage firm, they get a lower wage. And so it turns out that firms are explaining something between like 10 and 20% of wages that we see. And this sort of harkens back to like an older view of the labor market, sort of in the 1940s and 50s, where sort of I think institutionalist labor economists kind of got this. I conjecture it's as a result of their experience on the War Labor Board and stuff, but like it's actually the case that firms have a fair amount of discretion in how they set wages and working conditions. And just like the threat of workers quitting isn't nearly as tight a disciplining device on firms as you might think. And so there's like a room for all the things that, personnel economics and sociologists have sort of pointed to about firm cultures and norms and HR practices and all of these other things that matter, have some scope to matter once you understand that wages are not kind of set by the law of one price inside the labor market. Let me sort of say one more thing about, I think, the relationship between this kind of view of market power where employers set wages. I don't think it's necessarily the only source of employer power. There's a kind of an older one that's like less famous these days, but the labor discipline model, where like what's happening is that employers are need to ensure that workers are exerting effort, and so they pay workers more than their outside option, so that the threat of firing a worker is credible. And I think that's really real and true. And I actually think one of the reasons we've seen more monopsony in recent periods is possibly because some of these labor discipline forces have become weakened because of the rise of monitoring technology. And so it's something that I'm trying to operationalize, but if you imagine that we've gotten a lot better at monitoring workers, so now employers can actually use the monopsony power that was latent before. So they couldn't use it before because they needed to provide incentives, but now that they've got enough monitoring that they don't need to provide these incentives, they can now sort of lower wages even more. And then the last point I'll make is that there's a real role for the unemployment and macroeconomic conditions here. It's like when the unemployment rate is high, workers find it that much harder to quit. And so the very fact that the propensity to voluntarily quit moves with the unemployment rate so much should just give you pause that this idea that like, oh, the laissez-faire labor market kind of gives you conditions of freedom on the ground. It's like, how could it be that the amount of freedom that workers have varies so much with the business cycle?
Great, thank you so much, Suresh. So Alex, picking up where I left off, as a social scientist and political scientist, that's your perspective, that's your disciplinary perspective on the civic impact, among other things, of unequal power in the workplace. So tell us a bit about your findings.
Sure, yes. Cindy, if you were channeling Sam for some of this, particularly where I think about the civic potential of the workplace, I feel like I'm channeling some of your earlier work that talks about just how important the workplace can be in forming civic identities and nurturing civic association between Americans who might not otherwise come into contact with one another. But I also think there are important ways that the unequal bargaining power relationship that the other panelists have been discussing interferes with this process and really threatens the civic potential of the workplace. So to back up for a moment, why do I think it is that the workplace has so much of this potential for serving as a site of civic engagement and participation? I think there are really three reasons for this. One, workers have an opportunity to interact with people who may share different views from themselves. Two, workers can gain skills and information that are relevant to participating in politics and the civic process more generally. And three, workers can be recruited. They can find opportunities to connect with organizations or other like-minded individuals to participate in politics. And in fact, I think when we look at these three dimensions, there are ways in which the workplace is uniquely well suited as compared to other civic spaces in our lives. And that's because, at least pre-COVID, and hopefully again soon, it's a place where we spend most of our lives if we're working full time. And so as a result, it's a place where many of us form the kind of identities that we hold, the values that we hold, and establish friendships and social connections with others. I think it's also uniquely important because, unlike other places in our lives right now, like churches or schools or other types of civic organizations, the workplace isn't typically sorted by politics, at least not yet. And I review in my unequal bargaining power brief research that suggests that the vast majority of workers aren't picking a workplace based on the political views of their coworkers or their employer. In a similar vein, it is not yet the case that most workers work alongside a majority of other coworkers who share their political views. That is to say, there's no big sort by the workplace. Most of us come into contact, depending on our occupation and our industry. This varies to some extent, but on average, it tends to be the case that most people are working alongside other coworkers that share different political views, values from their own. If we look at the survey data that I report in the unequal bargaining power brief, it's about over 60% of workers who say that they work alongside many individuals who do not share their own partisan views. And this is important because past research by others has suggested that coming into contact with these cross-cutting views and exchanges can lead individuals to become more tolerant of one another's opposing political perspectives in some, but certainly not all, circumstances. And to the last point, how the workplace can serve as a site of civic participation and education, I think for many of us, we can think about how the skills we learn at work, for instance, how to interact with one another, how to work alongside one another, how to participate in a meeting, all of these things are relevant for the civic process, participating in other civic organizations and parts of political life. And the other way in which this interacts with the workplace is clearly through organizations that are established around the basis of workplace identities, most notably here, labor unions that can provide civic opportunity, training, and recruitment for workers. But I mentioned that unequal bargaining power, I think, threatens the potential of the workplace to serve as this site for civic engagement and education. And I think there are three reasons why this is the case. So first and fundamentally, the insecurity and threat that's posed by at-will employment that Cindy outlined from Sam's work means that workers who don't have a lot of the bargaining power that Suresh was describing may fear speaking out about politics to the extent that it puts their job at risk, given that, as Cindy put it quite strikingly, in the United States, in many cases, you can be fired for no reason at all. And the presumption of terminations falls on the worker to prove that it was for a protected cause rather than the employer. So this in many ways creates a chilling effect on political exchanges. And we have good reason, I think, to think that this has worsened, particularly in recent years with the decline of labor unions and the spread of judicial rulings and public policy that weakens workers' bargaining power. Second, and I think just as importantly, the decline of the labor movement has removed the source of civic training and education and skills building for many workers, and especially low-paid workers and workers with lower levels of formal education. As I review in my brief, there is still evidence to suggest, even in their weaker form today, that unions boost the civic skills and interest and engagement of workers who might not otherwise participate in the political process. And I think one of the most vivid ways of looking at this is to take workers who have just a high school degree or less, compare them to those with a college degree or more. In the general workforce, we see some really striking inequalities in interest, engagement, and participation across education, for instance. But when you look at the labor movement, workers who have a high school degree or less, but who are part of a labor union, their civic profile looks a lot more like those with a college degree or more. And in fact, on some measures are the same, if not more, more engaged in politics. So the decline of labor unions really threatens this, this closing of inequalities in civic engagement. And then I think there's a broader macro story to this as well. The erosion of worker voice through the labor movement has also has ramifications for the broader political process. When we think about the constellation of organized interests that are participating in the policymaking process in elections, unions are and have been one of the few nation-spanning mass organizations that represent the interests of low and middle income Americans, that there are a few other organizations with the same kind of scale and reach throughout American history that have had that kind of impact. Without those kinds of organizations, the policymaking process becomes decidedly more tilted away from the interests of those kinds of workers. And I think we see that playing out today when we look at debates over economic relief and infrastructure spending and the absence of, I think, worker voice notably in many of those discussions. So in short, I think unequal bargaining power has always undermined the potential of the civic engagement in the workplace, but I think there's reason to be much more concerned about it today than in the past. So I'll stop there, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Alex. So Liz, you are very rare among philosophers for taking seriously issues of workplace hierarchy and workplace inequality. So tell us why you think those things matter from a philosophical perspective.
Yeah, well, one of the things philosophers are interested in is freedom. And in most political philosophy, the principal obstacle to freedom is represented as the state, right, or the principal threat. And in fact, if we think about not state, but actually government more generally, there's all kinds of private government. That is government, both in the sense that it exists in the so-called private sector, but it's also private in the sense that power is exercised over people in a relatively unaccountable manner. And this follows then is really the focus of my examination of the employment relationship and how that constitutes a form of private government. And there's really at least two sources of unequal power within the workplace. And one of the ones, of course, comes from this Lochner-Wright assumption, employment at will, which gives the employer the power to fire a worker for no reason at all, or arbitrary reasons that are completely unconnected with things like efficient or anything that's specifically work related. The employment contract itself tends to be open-ended. The default employment contract doesn't specify precisely what you have to do or rule out all kinds of orders that might be irrelevant to production. The second source of unequal power in the employment relationship just has to do with the fact that the corporate charter, right, the legal system, which is set up by the state, grants employers essentially dictate power within the firm. There's some accountability to shareholders if it's a publicly held corporation, or to owners in a closely held firm. But basically, workers are cut out of any participation in the actual governance of the firm. And a result of these two forms of inequality in the employment relationship is that employers can rule workers' lives. Within the firm, when they're at work, workers face minute regulations of their speech. They don't have privacy rights. They can face arbitrary drugs testing independent of any safety considerations. They don't have any control over their time. Often they're given arbitrary time schedules. It means that they also lack freedom in the rest of their lives to plan ahead. You know, you can't even get a community college course going if your employer might just call you in randomly, right? And then you can't attend the course, or any other planning you might need. And even the minimal rights that workers do have are in actual practice unenforceable due to factors such as mandatory arbitration. It's important to consider that it's not just the case that workers lack freedom at work, but off duty too, because the employer can fire you because they don't like what you do for recreation. Or maybe you smoke and they don't like that, or you're smoking marijuana, or maybe they don't like, who you're dating. Now, there are some anti-discrimination protections, but they only cover a narrow range of discriminatory categories. And there's many arbitrary reasons why an employer can fire somebody that aren't covered by anti-discrimination law. If we think of these two separate sources, right, we have the unequal bargaining power and the employment at will regime, but we also have the fact that employers, by the nature of corporate governance, call all the shots in the workplace. That opens up a possibility for thinking about how to write this. And one of the things that I suggest is we have to rethink the constitution of enterprise governance, which now puts all the authority cards in the hands of the employer, and think about what might be done to give workers a voice in the governance of the firm itself. And, in, of course, an ideal world, they might actually own and run the corporation. We do have some examples of successful workers' cooperatives, but in many cases, that's not going to be feasible for them. And I suggest that we should take a look at co-determination, pioneered by Germany, where workers are guaranteed a voice both on the shop floor, where there are works councils, and the actual day-to-day management of work is joint between representatives of the workers and representatives of the shareholders. But also workers have seats on the board of directors in any large corporation. And that kind of revision, I think, could play an important role in equalizing power between workers and capitalists, and also put less burden on the state to impose regulations. Because as we know, state regulation of labor conditions is often ineffective. Even basic things like workplace safety. An interesting example, Reveal, investigative reporters did an investigation of the fact that Amazon warehouses have twice the injury rate of comparable warehouses, often because just of the speed up of expectation, quota production demands. And state of Indiana noticed that there were serious injuries and even fatalities going on, and the state OSHA tried to impose regulation. And Amazon just said, if you do that, we're just gonna close down this warehouse and move across the border, right? And so the state lacks, right? They're afraid of losing the jobs, so they back down. And there's no effective regulation. But if workers have seats on the board, right, that would be another way for them to have a voice and some decision-making power, and firm actually makes its decisions.
Okay, thanks so much, Liz. Before I turn things over to Jenny, I just wanted to mention to the audience, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat function, because I'm hoping that we will have some time for audience Q&A. But Jenny, you have devoted your career to advancing inclusion and equal opportunity at work. Much of what we've been talking about has been what we might call economic or class inequality of bargaining power. But how does that kind of unequal power, that's sheer economic inequality within the employment relationship, affect workers' ability to challenge discrimination and harassment?
Well, thanks so much, Cindy, for having me here for this terrific conversation. Before my time at DOL, my co-author Jane Liu and I wrote a paper highlighting how the promise of our anti-discrimination laws has not been fully realized because our current enforcement system hasn't confronted the fundamental power imbalance underpinning the employment relationship. We highlight 3 areas in particular where we see this power imbalance undermining enforcement of our civil rights laws, and I'll briefly highlight them here. First, at the root of the problem is a system that places the primary responsibility for enforcing anti-discrimination laws on individual workers. Workers must file complaints with their employer or a government agency, and this complaint-driven system requires workers to learn of the problem, have sufficient evidence, and then publicly accuse their employer of discrimination. Workers have to have the resources to hire a lawyer or to get the government to bring an enforcement action. And government agencies have historically not had sufficient resources to pursue the magnitude of claims or to sufficiently protect workers from retaliation. And because of these substantial hurdles, we haven't seen consistent accountability for discrimination. And this has led to the lack of sufficient incentives for employers to truly prioritize proactive efforts to understand if problems exist and then to address them. What we saw with the Me Too movement is this national attention to a broken complaint system. Many organizational systems can operate to protect the powerful, and often they turn against individuals who come forward to raise a complaint, seeing them as a threat to the organization rather than someone trying to help the organization improve. What we saw is that 2/3 of workers who came forward to file a sexual harassment charge reported experiencing retaliation. 64% reported that they lost their job. As a result, many researchers I know say they would never tell anyone to use the complaint system because of that data. Researchers estimate that over 99% of workers who have faced sexual harassment actually never file a complaint because of these risks. And the COVID-19 pandemic has heightened the power imbalance because workers are increasingly fearful of organizing and raising concerns in an unstable job market. The second problem we see is the dramatic asymmetry of information and resources between employers and employees. This can create often insurmountable hurdles for workers in trying to protect their rights. It has enabled, as others have mentioned, employers to write contractual rules, including forced arbitration and non-disclosure agreements that often serve to silence claims and undermine effective enforcement. Workers, when they do come forward, they often don't have critical information that they need to demonstrate how these practices are operating in a discriminatory fashion. And we see that particularly with things like hiring and pay. We'll see practices, for example, like relying on prior salary or carrying forward discrimination, or a practice like a very common but often discriminatory practice like subjective review of resumes or interviews. without sufficient guidance on job-related criteria can also operate to discriminate. So this information asymmetry makes it very difficult for workers to challenge the practice because they don't often have the knowledge of the practices, how they're operating, impacting people, or the data that they need. And third, the legal system has created a number of legal doctrines that don't take into account this vast information and power imbalance. So for example, workers often have to have a high level of evidence to even support a complaint, even before they've had access to the discovery process to get that evidence that they need. We also see that many of our federal anti-discrimination laws create gaps in coverage for our most vulnerable workers, including a growing number of independent contractors and workers in the gig economy, as well as farm workers and domestic workers, leaving them without fundamental civil rights protections. So in sum, because these legal and institutional structures have not grappled with the vast information and power imbalances, our systems haven't created sufficient accountability for discrimination. Where workers speak up, it's a great risk to themselves with a small chance of success. So as a result, many workers don't come forward to report discrimination, and because there is little accountability. So our paper also highlights a number of solutions to rebalance the power disparities and create enforcement mechanisms that focus on a more shared and proactive effort that places a greater responsibility on the entities that are most well-positioned with information and power to address that discrimination. So that means employers, unions, worker centers, government agencies, as well as the courts have a greater role to play in protecting civil rights. And I'll just briefly mention a few of those solutions here. One is policies that encourage transparency and that require data collection by employers that can help support accountability. Another is more proactive efforts by the government to understand where problems exist rather than relying primarily on complaints. So the agency I lead now, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, enforces anti-discrimination and affirmative action requirements for federal contractors. So we conduct compliance evaluations for federal contractors. We proactively review data on hiring, pay, and promotion, and that helps us to identify potential barriers. And finally, we need meaningful accountability and incentives for employers to address discrimination in their workplace. And we need to close the gaps in protections that preclude employers from allowing through contract to force employers to contract away their rights. And so I'll just close with one thought, that this moment does present a truly unprecedented opportunity to address some of these long-standing issues, because more people are beginning to understand that our systems, including employment systems, can operate to perpetuate discrimination. We see America's employers making powerful statements in support of racial justice, and we have a vital opportunity to ensure we address this fundamental power imbalance. Thanks so much.
Great. So thank you so much, Jenny. And that's just about the perfect time to switch over. We're starting to get questions, and I'll invite Steve Greenhouse to ask his own question.
So thank you. This is an excellent panel. And I thank everyone for appearing on it. I thank you, Cindy, for putting it together. So several of you might have noticed that the lead story in today's New York Times has the headline, "Workers are gaining leverage over employers." The lead sentence, the first sentence says, "The relationship between American businesses and their employees is undergoing a profound shift. For the first time in a generation, workers are gaining the upper hand." This points to some rebalancing changes in the unequal bargaining power that so many of us have written about over the years. But I wanted to ask Larry and the other panelists, what is your sense? How do you respond to this story in today's Times?
Larry, take it away.
I'll just say a second. So I do think there is something going on, and I do find it a little bit surprising. I have viewed the situation of especially low-wage workers as ones where they have very few options. They can't change their life at work because there's not access to unions. The government isn't doing anything in terms of high labor standards. There's usually high unemployment, can't go to courts, et cetera. So, the question is, why is there some leverage now? And it may be that people are a little bit more flush because of the checks and the extra UI, although people in the center left seem unwilling to acknowledge that. I think that is probably somewhat the case, and that's good. But I'll also say, we have to wait a little bit for more data to see how much of this is embedded in actual wage rates, not just bonuses. My colleague Josh Bivens has showed that a lot of the wage increases in hospitality may be due to the coming back of tips. So anyway, I think there's something there. I'm not sure it's all, we all have a great explanation for it, worth monitoring.
Larry, can you talk to whether this temporary labor shortage and the greater bargaining power right now might lead to some longer term rebalancing of bargaining power, or is this just a flash in the pan?
I hope it will, but I'm not sure that it will, and I think it's something to monitor. But I've also believed the following, which is that if workers broadly found that there was some way to establish leverage, it would catch like wildfire across the workplaces. That we haven't seen many victories. So I think it may change people's perceptions of their own agency, and I think that would be very powerful.
Thank you.
So I want to get Suresh's view on this, but this does remind me of a very powerful message that comes across from Liz's book. And that is, the bargaining power that workers have at the entry phase when they're looking around among different employers is an entirely different story from the bargaining power they have once they're in the relationship. And the economic thinking tends not to take that fully into account. But Suresh, did you want to add anything on this this sort of current possible shift?
Yeah, I was just looking at this morning and looking at this, I kind of like looking at voluntary quits as like a proxy for tightness, because like the idea that like when someone's like, no, I'm walking away from this job, that's like a measure of tightness as opposed to just kind of the overall unemployment rate. And that's actually like also up, like it's at 2.5 or something, which is where it was in like March 2018. And so I'm just like, I think there is something happening, as Larry said, and then it's a question of just like, is it a flash in the pan? Does it get institutionalized somehow? Those are kind of the where is it coming from? Those are all important questions. Should I answer the first one or?
Sure. I'm going to get Brishan in just a moment.
Yeah, so I think there is a lot of, but there is something when workers are actually have an offer, when they're shopping for a job, they are somewhat more mobile, but then they're also coming out of unemployment often. And so you'll often have that they're like, I need a job. And so I think while there is like some degree that when you're job shopping, you are more mobile, you're also coming from a place where you're probably like, needing a job. So I'm not sure that like it's actually, and I think when we look at the evidence, like quote unquote recruit elasticity in some sense is pretty similar to the quit elasticity. So I don't know that there's a big difference in the amount of market power that employers have on the recruit side versus the quit side.
So I see Brishan raised his hand. He doesn't want us to know what his question is, but that's okay. Go ahead, Brishan.
Sorry. It's two quick comments. One, I get both sort of to Steve's question. One sort of piece of countervailing evidence is, of course, the Amazon unionization drive, right? Workers were really gaining the upper hand. I think and if there were kind of stirrings of a real mass mobilization, we may well have seen a different result there. The other thing I wanted to just add as a piece of anecdata, but one that's really interesting to me anyway, and don't make fun of me for this, my wife and family and I are up on Cape Cod for a couple of weeks. We're hearing from people here that seasonal workers are being offered over $25 an hour in order to, just fill up the restaurants and hotels and everything else. And I don't think that that is necessarily a sign of a rebalancing of bargaining power so much as it is that the supply of guest workers has been cut off. And we don't have a sort of the circuits anymore where people come up here from within the continental US for the season, as happened a few decades back. But a lot of businesses really are struggling, and teenagers are making enormous sums of money when they can work 40 hours a week, or however many they can work during the summer.
Okay, so I see, Steve, did you leave yourself open to respond to this? Is that why you're not on mute? I'm just trying to figure out, because I see that Sandy Jacoby had his own answer to the question that you posed. And so Sandy, if you're here, why don't you ask your own question?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Well, that was just an observation jumping off from the New York Times article that appeared recently about global population decline. It's nothing of note, just that these are the kind of effects that we might anticipate as populations decline. Although, as somebody who studies Japan, which is in the vanguard of shrinking nations, we haven't seen those effects of tighter labor markets. But what I'm wondering about is a more historical question, perhaps tied to I guess I'm an aging curmudgeon in that a number of the things that were discussed, such as the role of unions in promoting micro and macro democracy, and evidence that, in a shorthand, there are internal labor market effects that we observe, which, the democracy part, you can go back to J. David Greenstone and earlier writers and see them making the same arguments. The internal labor market analysis, institutional labor economists, the late 40s and 1950s. I'll just throw out a name, Clark Kerr, for example. My old professor, Lloyd Allman, wrote about these things. And certainly labor discipline in the workplace. I don't know when it first popped up, but that Koletsky's work really emphasized that, and sociologists like Baldamus in the early 60s as well. So what strikes me is that there's a reemergence of ideas that kind of go back to the 40s and 50s and 60s, which we saw as kind of the golden period for workers and labor. And I'm just wondering why there's been, seems to be, if you will, what's going on, why we seem to be returning intellectually to ideas from an earlier period that was a more optimistic period than our own.
So I saw Larry go like this. I think that's his raised hand.
Yeah. We can, so as someone who considers myself a, diehard institutionalist by training and every other way, we're seeing people coming back to old truths. I mean, Suresh's work, he frequently goes back to Joan Robinson's book on, monopsony, the institutionalist labor market economist. This project was inspired by Ruth Bader Ginsburg's dissent in Epic Systems, which basically challenged the majority, saying, don't you people realize that there's unequal power? And that's why we had the Fair Labor Standards Act and the NLRA. So yeah, I mean, this is reestablishing old lost truths, and it's partly because of 4 decades of wage suppression, the loss of labor share, that the that the center-left economists, the right-wing economists will never talk about power, but the center-left economists like Larry Summers have written a paper that eroded workers' power explains inequality. That's pretty amazing. And they have turned their back kind of quietly on the whole skill bias technological change explanation of wage inequality. So, you know, we're sort of getting beyond the whole human capital revolution that happened in the 1960s and that crowned competitive labor markets as the starting place and ending place for all labor market analysis. And that's a great thing.
So Suresh, you had an interesting term here that I wanted you to explain. You said, true on macro policy too, we're back to paleo-Keynesianism.
I was just pointing out, like, it's not just in the labor economics that we're kind of seeing a rekindling of like post-war ideas. We're also, like, I think in macro policy, kind of back into a world where it's like, yeah, no, it's really the problem is that we're just kind of have inadequate aggregate demand. And, you know, the problem is that, you know, the potential output never recovered from the 2010 crisis. So I think it's just like, you know, if you thought the two flavors of economics that we had in the post-war period were like high Keynesianism and macro policy and institutionalist labor economics, they're kind of like two halves that are coming back.
So I wanted to say something and toss it over to the group about Rishan's comment that, gee, if we were really seeing a resurgence of worker empowerment, why didn't we see a different result at Amazon? And what it makes me think is that what, you know, the economists who hold this view that labor markets are competitive enough would say, yeah, workers really, when labor markets are functioning, they don't need labor unions. And so the whole premise of labor organizing is that individual equality of bargaining power is a myth. But if workers are seeing decent wages out of ordinary labor market dynamics, and that was part of the message that came across from reporting on the Amazon thing, they maybe don't think they need unions. Liz?
Yeah, I just want to say that a major issue for workers at Amazon warehouses is safety. It's not just wages, it's safety and the insane pace of production. So a lot of the concerns of workers had to do with control of the shop floor and day-to-day conditions. So I don't think the defeat here of the union drive is due to that I thought that things are all great. I think it was fear, right? They're intimidated. Workers get the upper hand in propagandizing against labor unions. And there's also, frankly, a loss of knowledge of how to organize effectively, of what the actual benefits are from talking to other unionized workers. There's almost no unionized workers left in the private sector. And there's that loss of knowledge, I think, makes people afraid to move ahead, along with the fact that if you are known to be active, you get fired. Now that's illegal, but in practice, you lose your job if you become known to be a labor activist, and you don't have any effective recourse against that.
So I am struck when I talk to young people in the labor movement, how often there's a family history in the labor movement. And as the labor movement shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, there have been many fewer children growing up with any consciousness of what unions have done for their families and people like them.
Young people have some of the most positive views of unions,
yeah,
in polling, and it's kind of interesting. I just want to add one other dimension about the Bessemer, which is, you know, that's a state which has the federal minimum wage of very low, $7.15, where the state itself overruled Birmingham's having a higher minimum wage, so that workers' options, you know, it is a challenge to realize that sometimes what we consider to be jobs of poor quality look to workers like a better option than what's available. You know, I learned that here in Washington, D.C. when Walmart opened up, and there were lines around the block to get a Walmart job, and we know Walmart pays very, very little. So the fact is, it really calls attention to really looking at what are people's options, as well as the whole issue about their ability to change their circumstances, which gets to do with the difficulty of using rights under the NLRA to actually assert your power.
So we are up to our time limit, and I just want to close by thanking Larry so much for launching this project. It's an excellent time to be reopening this conversation, both because of the opportunity for workers to sort of start reshaping their own future, but also because questions about market fundamentalism and the heretofore prevailing wisdom on labor markets and regulation and politics are starting to be questioned very widely. So it's a great conversation to be generating right now. And do all go to the EPI website to see the growing list of papers on unequal bargaining power from a whole range of disciplinary perspectives. So I want to thank everybody for a lively and engaging session. See you elsewhere. Nice to see you, Steve. Oh, Steve's gone. Oh, no, there you are.
Good to see you, Cindy.
Good to see you. Okay, so this room is about to be taken over by a different session. So farewell, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Hey, Don.
Hi, Matt. How are you? Let me, there we are.
How are things?
Okay. After having, all that crummy weather here in Newport, and then all of a sudden it's instant summer.
Yeah.
We're inside.
Yeah, I know. It's too bad this conference wasn't last weekend. We could have been
Perfect.
hunkered down with, 48-degree weather, but
Yeah. Oh, well.
yeah.
There's Mike. Hi, Mike.
Like,
And Dale will be with us, I guess.
oh, is that?
Dale Bellman is, I see. That's Dale B.
Yeah, guess so. Yep.
But this isn't starting until quarter
Oh,
to
it's
two.
about like a half hour or so, I think, but I figured I would just log on and stay on the stream. So,
Okay.
so we got about 40 people for Friday's chapter meeting so far, Don.
Oh, good.
Hopefully, maybe we'll get a few more. I sent out a reminder yesterday or
Yeah,
Friday.
I saw that.
Friday.
I think I'm registered. I hope I'm registered.
Yeah, I probably check that out, but
I've got the agenda right in front of me. So let me think. Well, you saw that I got Paul O'Reilly and his CFO, whose name escapes me at the moment, set up
Yeah.
for.
And I've reserved a room at the Radisson.
Okay.
I've gotten a sort of a bigger room. I don't know how many, who knows what's going to happen, but I got the somewhat bigger room downstairs. I don't know if that was a good idea or not. I don't know. We'll see. I was a little concerned because the small room they sometimes put us in, you know, it's really, I always get a little nervous we're going to overbook. And
Yeah.
the somewhat larger room upstairs was already used by another group. So they put us downstairs and, but I hope we're not like, kind of rumbling around in that room, but we'll see.
I hope so, but I think, well, I'm counting on people being curious about this topic.
Yeah, I hope so.
I know that O'Reilly was a little concerned. You know, he said, "Will there be union organizers there?" And I said, "Well, there'll certainly be union representatives. I think some of them are involved in organizing, but they're certainly, And I went through the discussion who our membership is, and he said, "Well, as you might expect, he said, I don't mind." He said, "I'm happy to talk with anybody about it, but some people think that they're a threat to unionization." I said, "Well,
Oh, yeah.
it's could be exciting."
Yeah. Well, yeah, it'll be interesting. Are we it's just going to be the two of them speaking, or is there, are we going to do any sort of discussant or anything, or probably?
Well, I think the short answer is yes, it'll be the two of them speaking and then questions and answers.
Oh, okay.
I think that was the general format. If it had been O'Reilly alone, we might have had time to have some discussants, but he sounds like he wants to have his CFO there too. So I think just with the interest of time, and my guess is that there'll be, I'll be sure to prepare a question or two, and I assume you might too, and then that ought to kick off the discussion.
Yep.
So it's a long ways away. Seems like a long ways away.
Well, yes, although you know how next thing you know it's upon us, right? But we got to get through Friday first. But
yeah. The other thing, I haven't been sailing at all, and I need to get over to the naval station. And
I haven't either. I'm it's like every day I tell myself I got to call Sail Newport and schedule a checkout and all this kind of stuff. I was thinking of doing, they do this, I saw on their website where they say that you can do like a 1 hour refresher prior to a checkout. Since I didn't sail at all last summer, I was giving it some thought, but I don't know. We'll see.
Well, of course, I'm a Sail Newport member too, but I've never tried to qualify there. I wonder if we could do it together.
Yeah, I'm sure we could.
Worth a try. I want to get a refresher over at the naval station to get the Roads 19 certification too. Yeah. I'm certified. I just haven't taken a roads out in 2 years now, and so need to get a little hands-on before I take anybody like you out. So I'll take one of the instructors out.
Yep. John Ravitt, how you doing?
Is this a Matt Boda fan club?
Absolutely.
I also remember Mr. O'Brien, but it's been a few, I don't know what conference, but.
We were in Cleveland together.
Was that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It could have been other places. What was?
Well, the last time I saw you, John, was in Cleveland.
Okay. At an IRA
I think
or
what's that now?
I said an IRA, and that would really date me. That's before your time.
Oh no, it's not before my time, but I was I've been going to national meetings since 1988. So
And I only joined when I was a grad student at UMass Amherst in
well, the first time I went,
76. What?
the first time I
Wow.
went to a national meeting was when I was a grad student at Michigan State. The meeting was in New York City. But
Oh. I remember you as a grad student. I saw your papers.
yeah, time flies, doesn't it,
Make
John?
reference to. Someday I'll talk to you about one of my research projects is what I call a professor's disease.
Okay.
You get old and you keep doing some research and some publications and or conferences because you still think you know something,
Right.
but no, and you have something to share. And so that's one of my hobbies, along with gardening and fishing. I do a little golf, but not much. I caddied for 4 years. I got to hate and love golf. So,
Yeah.
Mr. O'Brien. So Mr. Boda was a grad student at Michigan State, and was quite an one of our best students.
I'm not surprised.
He did good research, and I think he taught for us and all that stuff.
I did do that, yes.
What?
Yes, I did. I did a lot of labor extension teaching back then.
Yeah, and that was what my job originally at MSU was, to be a labor educator.
Oh,
At 36 years there of hard labor.
wow.
Well, anyways, can you remind me who you are, sir? Because I've met you, but I can't remember why I know who you are.
It's okay. Well, now I'm an arbitrator and a mediator, and I live in the same town as Matt. I live in Newport, Rhode Island.
Oh, wow.
But quick arc of the career was that after I got out of the Navy, I did a master's in industrial relations at Loyola in Chicago. And then I was in Milwaukee for about 5 years, where I learned hardball labor relations. And then
I mean, you did Kohler strike or something?
I was the first director of personnel at the sewerage district,
Wow.
regional wastewater treatment and flood control agency, and had the threat of the strike the 5th day I was on the job. And they did strike almost exactly a year later.
When did you do those degrees?
I'm sorry?
What was the year you did your degrees? That
I did the by Loyola 68 for the bachelor's, and then after I got out of the Navy, the MSIR was 76.
That's not much different than me. I had my bachelor's degree at a place called University of Michigan in 72.
Okay.
And then went to grad school at UMass Amherst and left there in 76 and came to Ann Arbor and worked for a couple named High and Joyce Kornblue for a year. Joyce was quite a labor historian. High was quite a labor educator. And then MSU hired me in 77 and I did 36.
Wow. Okay. Actually, when I was an undergraduate at Loyola, I was dating a girl who had just arranged to transfer to the University of Michigan. So we dated long distance. So I commuted to Ann Arbor from Chicago. And eventually, at the end of that year, we got married, and we're still married. And
good for you. I'm still married. I met my wife we got married in 70 as undergrads in Ann Arbor.
And we were still undergrads
with
in
me for
67.
51 years. And, I'm not going to let her overhear me much because, it might end it. So why do I know you? I mean, you've been at these lyric like conferences for years.
I have. I was president of the IRRA in 98. I was still a management side guy at that point.
Okay. Who are you working for?
At that time, I was working for the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District in Chicago.
Okay.
And I retired from that that year. And
Okay.
I went to FMCS. So I was a federal mediator in the Chicago office.
So you know, I knew Don Powers well,
I didn't know that, but okay.
but you know who he was. He died a couple of years ago. He was an FMCS for sort of our Saginaw Bay City area. Matt must have known him some too.
Powers?
Don Powers, yeah. He was
Was
an
it-
FMCS.
I'm trying to think. Are you sure it was John? It was
Don Powers.
maybe I'm thinking of a different guy. There was
Saginaw Bay
Powers
City area.
who was in their international group, and he was he'd been a Franciscan priest at one point in his.
I don't know who you're talking about.
Okay, well, it was a different Powers then.
But didn't you say FMCS?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's what Don Powers was. He was a mediator for FMCS. He you know, Joel Gershenfeld, of
of
course.
course.
And Joel was a faculty member probably during the Boda years.
I remember his parents.
I understand that. I remember his parents a little. And but more I know Joel and his wife and his kids. One of my daughters was a babysitter for Joel's kids when he was here. Anyways, Joel worked with Don Powers and did some very interesting things with some of the data that FMCS had in that part of Michigan that Don and Joel worked on.
Okay.
Anyways, you know, also at MSU, the program started in the mid-50s. And over the years, two major professors were leaders in IRA, Charles Killingsworth
I remember that name. I
and
remember,
Jack Stieber.
I remember that name too. And Richard Block.
Well, Rich Block is still around. He and I
Yeah.
we have a three family get together about every other month here in East Lansing. He and his wife have two daughters and multiple grandkids, and he's doing fine.
Good.
Yeah. So anyways, you gave presentations, and that's why, and we probably chatted at happy hours or something. And
I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I when you were mentioning your first meeting in '76, when I went to Milwaukee, I got sort of, I'd been introduced to IRA when I was at Loyola as a grad student, but I never got particularly active. But when I went to Milwaukee, the secretary treasurer of the Wisconsin chapter was a fellow named Bob Garnier, and he was the director of personnel for the city of Milwaukee. He saw me coming. So it didn't take very long before I was the secretary treasurer of the Wisconsin chapter. Mm-hmm. And
it was probably a pretty active chapter.
It was an incredible group. They were really strongly supported by both labor and management. The president of the state AFL-CIO, John Schmidt, was there every meeting. And so everybody from labor showed up, everybody from the Milwaukee Federation of Labor, all the union folks. And Milwaukee was still very much a union town in those days.
Right.
And the employers were Square D and Alice Chalmers and and the breweries and on and on. So
and the city itself.
And the city, yeah, the public sector.
It was one of the first really strong public sector union movements in America.
Well,
Probably
that's right. It was the first public sector
in New
collective
York
bargaining act in the country.
Yeah.
And so, and AFSCME, of course, was born in Madison.
Right.
And so when we had the strike, it was the other folks from the labor side that I had met and gotten to know through the Wisconsin chapter that really kind of saved me. emotionally because I was getting vilified on the 10 o'clock news and then the Milwaukee Journal, but the rest of the labor folks said, don't worry about it. That's just, that's.
Looks like some other people are coming on, so I'll stop our sharing,
Yeah, that's okay.
it's
Well, we'll
over,
catch
but
up another time.
two quick last comments. So another person at MSU was important, but I don't think he ever did IRA much, was Dan Kruger. He was
Don't
also
know that name.
an arbitrator. Okay. Okay. My other comment is, so you left Sewer Socialist America and went to New England?
No, actually, I left the People's Republic of Wisconsin after only 5 years. My former employer in Chicago, Illinois passed its Public Sector Collective Bargaining Act in 1983.
Okay.
And meanwhile, I had taken a year off to go to the Kennedy School. So I had just gotten back from that when my former employer called me up and made me an offer I couldn't refuse to return to Chicago. So I went back there or negotiated their first collective bargaining agreements. We had 16 unions. And
what year would that have been?
that was 84.
Guys, you know, this is all being recorded.
Oh, sorry.
Recording off.
We'll
Glad you-
stop talking.
That's all right. Anyway,
Stop recording.
anyway, so I was on the management side, as I say, for until 98 when I was the president of IRRA. And then I went to FMCS. But I was only there 7 years. So in 2006, I retired from FMCS and we moved back to Newport, Rhode Island, where I had started in the Navy in 1968.
That was your connection there. Okay.
That was the connection, yeah.
Okay.
So,
And that's where you live now, and that's why you're close to Boda.
well, I mean, I'd known Matt through IRRA Slant Lyra
Right.
long before we made the decision to come back to New England. But but when we made the decision, he and Susan were just unbelievably supportive in helping us get settled in here.
Well, of course.
So
You're a nice person. So.
it's been a great partnership ever since.
So are you still doing research or projects at all, or are you enjoying?
No, I hung out my shingle as an arbitrator when I moved here. And I've been doing arbitration, a few mediations, not many, but I've got an office in Chicago, a business address, and still have family in Chicago. So when I have cases in the Midwest, it's perfect for me. And then, but most of my work is in Rhode Island and southeastern Massachusetts these days. So that is just enough to keep my brain active. But
yeah.
And the local chapter here in Rhode Island is a great bunch of people, and
Cool.
I'm very fortunate with that too.
Nice. So who just talked a second ago?
Well, there's some of us here to get organized for our session starting in 5 minutes.
That was
All
me.
right.
That was me, Wilma, who spoke.
Okay, yeah, let's bring things together here a little bit. Okay.
Yeah.
Hello, Michael. Hello,
Hi,
Wilma.
Hey.
Looks like most of us here waiting. Stephen, I think I actually saw Stephen on the last session on the stream, so I assume he's lurking somewhere. Will be joining us soon. So I guess is there any last minute details we have to attend to? I think probably.
I was just going to ask, can you give a kind of in the chat at 6 minutes, a little warning?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
I don't
Yeah.
want to go too long.
Okay. Yeah. We'll do that.
Yeah, and I'm going to say up front, after many hours of trying to whittle the 7,000 word plus song paper into a short presentation, I'm right at about like 9 hours. 9 hours. 9 minutes and 45 seconds. So I think
Okay.
I'm like basically right at 10 minutes.
Okay, I'll, okay,
It'll
so
be shorter than that, so.
that's fine. I will, so my plan was, okay, so I'll try to accommodate everyone here. So Mike, maybe do 10, Wilma will say 6 minutes, I'll give you a warning. My plan, I think as I said in email, maybe yesterday, was maybe have each of you do your thing and then maybe give the other, to make it a little more conversational, let the other panelists say a few comments about what we just heard. And then at the end, you know, I guess we'll probably use depending on how many people we have. If there are lots of people, I think it's probably better if we just use the questions in the chat. If there are not, you know, more than 30 or so, then maybe we could just ask people to unmute themselves and ask questions or something. I don't know, but it's a little, sometimes a little tough to, and I don't have like a bunch of monitors going here. I just have my laptop. So it's hard for me to see all the participants too. So anyway, so I guess we'll be fine.
Sounds like a good plan.
It's just, I'm just going to say a few words at the beginning, very, very brief intros, and direct people to the bios on the conference website.
So Matthew, in the room that's directly behind you, I have to compliment your choice of paint colors.
Yes.
We call, we have different shades of it, but this is sort of light in your face sage in my room.
I see, yeah.
And hey, Steve.
Hey, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, 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 good.
Hey, Stephen.
Boiling in the 91-degree weather here. Hello, everybody.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very well, yeah.
Well, I imagine Rhode Island must be pretty steamy today.
Yeah, well, Newport, of course, we always get the nice ocean breeze.
Oh, that's true.
Too bad, but
you enjoy on your 100-foot yacht.
Yeah, well, Don and I were just talking about, we haven't gotten out sailing yet, but believe me, if you put about 5 of them together, it's about 100 feet, I guess. If you put about 5 of our boats together, but.
Isn't that a thing that they issue to labor scholars at URI? You come with your own small yacht?
Yeah, it's part of the startup package.
Yeah.
You
in Maine as well, right?
No, they handed me like some used skis and a small surfboard. So
actually, our Graduate School of Oceanography, I don't know if they're still doing this or not, but they used to take boats as donations and then sell them to bring some money into the school. So I don't know if they're still doing that. Don,
I looked at some of those when I first got here, and most of them were in pretty decrepit condition. They would take a lot of work and money to make them ship shape. But I think the program is still in effect.
So I'm going to be using PowerPoint, so I need to be made a co-host. Do I see Bernadette there in the background?
I think you probably can do it. Just check now, because I think it's automatically set up that way.
Yeah, just hit share screen, Michael. I think you might be able to do it.
Okay, I have share screen. All right, I don't have to be a co-host to do that. Okay.
Wilma, what does that French workers poster say, and why is it in English and not French?
Well, it's a Benchon World War II poster from the Office of War Information. And it says, "We French workers warn you, defeat means slavery, starvation, death." And in the back is an official Vichy decree.
Wow.
So it was, I think, 1941, Benchon.
Wow, that's great.
Stephen, what's that picture behind over your left shoulder? I've been looking at that.
Some Mexican guy named Diego Rivera.
Ah.
The flower vendor, yeah. So I haven't figured out how to do the thing that all the people on MSNBC do, where you have your book like that you just published or standing there somewhere where people can't miss it. So I will just sort of hold it up for a second here.
Yeah, that's you have a bookshelf back there, Michael. You should have just done it, you know, cover facing us in the book. That might be too far away, though.
It's a little bit too far away. I've been
you sell at least 2 extra copies if you do it for this panel.
Do you need anyone else to be co-host with you?
What's that now?
Do you need anyone else to be co-host with you?
I don't think so.
Okay. All right, sorry for interrupting.
Michael, everybody can do, I mean, people can do share screen if they want to. They don't have to be co-hosts, right?
Absolutely. You just need to be co-host so you can hit the recording. Oh, and I'm going to actually stop.